The air in the high-security wing of the prison doesn't smell like iron or sweat anymore. It smells like calculated silence. Everyone thinks they know what it looks like when a man finally breaks. They look for the trembling hands, the pleading eyes, or the hollow sound of a voice losing its will to live. But when they brought him here, shackled, bruised, and wearing a smile that looked more like a scar, the inmates didn't see a victim. They saw an opportunity. They thought they could tear him apart piece by piece until there was nothing left but a shell. What they didn't realize is that you cannot break a man who has already built his throne out of the debris of his own destruction. This isn't just a story of a prison brawl. It's a cinematic descent into the mind of a man who used his own suffering as a blueprint for a masterpiece of revenge. Before we dive into the dark corridors of this cell block to see how a hunted man became the ultimate predator, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. You won't want to miss a single second of this psychological game. The heavy steel gates of Iron Heights didn't just lock men in, they muffled the screams of those the world had chosen to forget. When Arthur, known to the streets only as the man with the painted smile, was pushed into the general population yard, the air shifted. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a ghost, draped in a stained orange jumpsuit, his eyes sunken and weary, carrying the weight of 1,000 tragedies. Elias Thorne, the man who owned every guard and every soul in that block, watched from the shadows of the upper tier. To Thorne, Arthur was just another toy to be dismantled, a trophy to prove that in this concrete hell, there was only one king. Thorne had built his empire on the broken spines of men who thought they were brave, and he viewed Arthur's arrival not as a challenge, but as an entertainment. For the first week, Thorne didn't use blades or fists. He used the slow, agonizing friction of silence and isolation. He had the guards place Arthur in a cell where the light never went out, a blinding white purgatory designed to strip a man of his sense of time and self. They deprived him of sleep, playing the recorded sounds of weeping children and city traffic through the vents at staggering volumes. But Arthur didn't scream. He didn't plead for mercy or bang his head against the reinforced glass. He sat cross-legged on the cold floor, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the stone, whispering names of people who were no longer alive. He wasn't losing his mind, he was organizing it. Every time a guard kicked his ribs during a routine inspection, or a gang member spat into his meager rations, Arthur simply looked up and smiled. A slow, terrifyingly patient smile that suggested he was exactly where he wanted to be. It wasn't the smile of a madman. It was the smile of a craftsman watching the foundation of his masterpiece settle. The psychological warfare reached its peak when Thorne finally decided to face his guest. On the 10th day, the yard went silent, the sort of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a public execution. Thorne stepped into the center of the dust-choked courtyard, flanked by 3 men whose necks were thicker than Arthur's waist. He grabbed Arthur by the jaw, forcing him to look into eyes that had ordered the deaths of dozens without a hint of remorse. Thorne had been a powerful man on the outside, a judge who had sent hundreds to this very prison while taking bribes from the cartels they belonged to. He was the personification of the rot Arthur had spent his life trying to burn away. "They tell me you're a comedian," Thorne hissed, his voice a low growl of practiced cruelty. "But I don't see anyone laughing. I see a pathetic man who thinks a little face paint makes him special. Down here, we don't do jokes, we do results." Thorne expected to see fear. He expected to see the light go out in Arthur's eyes, the moment where the villain realizes he is just a man in a cage. Instead, Arthur leaned into Thorne's grip, his breath smelling of the copper tang of his own blood. He didn't talk about the prison or the guards. He started talking about a small, quiet house on the outskirts of the city. The house Thorne had bought with blood money, where his elderly mother lived, blissfully unaware that her son was a monster. Arthur spoke of the exact flowers she planted in the spring and the way she liked her tea, his voice like dry leaves skittering across a grave. The color drained from Thorne's face faster than the blood from Arthur's split lip. The king of the prison suddenly looked like a peasant facing a ghost. The gang members around them shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the power dynamic had shifted without a single punch being thrown. "You think you're breaking me, Elias," Arthur whispered, blood staining his teeth as the smile returned, wider and more jagged than before. "But you've been broken for a long time. You're just a puppet who thinks he's holding the strings because he can't see the hands above him." Arthur stood up, ignoring the guards who moved to intervene. He reached into the waistband of his jumpsuit and pulled out something that shouldn't have been there. A small, tattered photograph, charred at the edges. It wasn't a picture of a victim or a weapon. It was a photo of Thorne's own daughter, the one who had supposedly disappeared years ago during one of Thorne's many business deals gone wrong. Arthur didn't hand it to him. He simply let the wind take it, watching as the paper fluttered into the dirt at Thorne's feet. As Thorne scrambled like a desperate animal to catch the floating ghost of his past, the realization hit the entire yard. Arthur hadn't been captured. He had surrendered. He hadn't come to Iron Heights to survive the gang. He had come to deliver a message that no wall could contain. Just as Thorne's fingers touched the photo, the heavy iron doors of the yard didn't just lock. They fused shut with a series of muffled explosions from the electronic locking mechanisms. The guards on the catwalks looked down, confused, only to realize their radios were dead. Arthur stood in the center of the chaos, the only calm soul in a sea of rising panic. He looked directly at Thorne, who was now trembling with the photo in his hand, and whispered the words that would haunt the prison for decades. "The joke isn't that you're trapped in here with me, Elias. The joke is that I'm the only one who brought a key." The silence that followed the lockdown was more deafening than any riot. In the flickering crimson glow of the emergency lights, the prison yard transformed into a cavernous theater of shadows. Thorne stood paralyzed, his fingers trembling as they clutched the weathered photograph of the daughter he had lost to his own greed years ago. The guards above were shouting, their boots drumming a frantic, useless rhythm against the metal catwalks. But down in the pit, the atmosphere was different. The inmates, men who had lived and breathed by Thorne's commands, began to circle. They didn't move toward Arthur, they moved toward Thorne. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the sudden sharp ozone of a dying power grid. Arthur leaned back against the cold stone wall, watching the predator become the prey with the detached curiosity of a man watching a sunset. "You told us she died in a car accident, Elias," one of Thorne's lieutenants whispered, his voice cracking with a decade's worth of suppressed rage. He was a man who had stayed loyal to Thorne because he believed they were all part of the same tragic brotherhood. "You told us we were a family and that the world outside took everything from us. But you didn't lose her, did you? You sold her. You traded your own blood to the very people we were supposed to be fighting just to secure your seat on that bench." The realization spread through the crowd like a virus. It wasn't just a betrayal of a daughter. It was a betrayal of the only code these men had left. Arthur's key wasn't a piece of metal or a digital code. It was the truth, stripped of its skin and left to bleed in front of a hungry audience. Arthur stepped forward, his movements fluid and hauntingly graceful amidst the rising tension. He didn't raise his voice, yet it carried to every corner of the yard, slicing through the panic. He spoke of the night Thorne had signed the papers, the cold calculations of a man who valued a title over a heartbeat. He described the look in the young girl's eyes, not fear, but a hollow, echoing disappointment that would never fade. As Arthur spoke, the inmates saw their own lives reflected in Thorne's sins. They weren't just prisoners. They were the collateral damage of a system run by men like Thorne, men who wore suits and gavels while orchestrating the very chaos they claimed to punish. Arthur wasn't the monster under their beds. He was the one who had finally turned on the lights to show them who was actually holding the knife. The violence, when it finally broke, was not a chaotic brawl, but a grim, silent ritual. The gang members, the outcasts, and the forgotten didn't use the shivs they had hidden in their sleeves. They used their hands. They tore the symbols of authority from Thorne's jumpsuit, stripping him of the king persona he had cultivated through fear. Thorne pleaded, his voice a pathetic whimper that no longer held the power to command. He looked to Arthur for help, a final desperate prayer to the man he had tried to break only hours before. But Arthur only watched, his expression one of profound, tragic empathy. He wasn't enjoying the pain. He was acknowledging its necessity. He was the architect who had pointed out the flaw in the foundation, and now the building was simply following the laws of gravity. As the heavy iron doors finally groaned under the pressure of the tactical teams arriving from the outside, the yard was a different place. The power surged back for a fleeting second, illuminating the scene. Thorne sat broken in the center of the dirt, alive but spiritually hollow, surrounded by men who no longer feared him. He had everything taken from him, not his life, but his legacy. Arthur, however, was no longer in the center of the fray. In the confusion of the smoke and the blinding flashbangs of the entering officers, he had retreated into the deepest shadows of the corridor, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had finished his work. He had entered the prison as a criminal, but he was leaving as something far more dangerous, a catalyst. The final image the security cameras captured before they were cut was not one of escape, but of a quiet, poetic surrender. Arthur stood by the exit, his face illuminated by the harsh white light of the searchlights. He looked back at the ruins of Thorne's empire, a kingdom of lies that had been leveled by a single, honest truth. He didn't run. He simply straightened his tattered jumpsuit and waited for the armored men to surround him. As they forced him to his knees, Arthur looked directly into the lens of the camera, his eyes shimmering with a strange, tearful clarity. He had realized that you don't need to burn the world down to change it. You just need to show the people that the fire is already burning inside them. The real joke was never about the prison walls. The joke was that the world thinks it's safe because the monsters are behind bars, never realizing that the bars are the only thing keeping the truth from coming home to roost. If you felt the weight of that ending, don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Who was the real villain in this story? I'll be reading your theories. Would you like me to create a sequel exploring Arthur's trial, or perhaps a prequel showing how he discovered Thorne's secrets?